The moving company arrived at my father's house on a Tuesday morning, and I watched from across the street as two men in gray overalls carried his leather recliner through the front door and loaded it into a truck. He was standing on the porch in a bathrobe, 71 years old, shouting into a phone that had already disconnected. I did not cross the street. I did not wave. I simply watched, the way you watch weather, with detachment, with the quiet understanding that what is happening has been in motion for a very long time. I had arranged everything through a property management firm 3 weeks prior, the irrevocable trust that held the deed to that house. The house I had purchased in 2019, the house he had been living in rent-free for 4 years, had been amended to remove his right of residency on the 1st of the month. His attorney received the certified notice on a Thursday. My attorney received the signed acknowledgement on a Friday. By Tuesday, the locks were changed and the moving company had been authorized to remove only items cataloged in the personal property addendum. The recliner was on the list. The flat-screen television was not. I am 31 years old. I have a master's degree in financial planning, a licensed fiduciary practice, and a file cabinet in my home office that contains 20 years of documentation, receipts, photographs, a handwritten note on a piece of lined paper that I have read so many times the fold lines have become tears. I know exactly why my father threw me out when I was 11. I have known for 6 years. What took 20 years was not the discovery, it was the architecture. Building something airtight takes time, and I was not willing to move until every joint was sealed. The morning he put me out, it was raining. I remember that with the precision of someone who has replayed the scene in clinical detail rather than emotional anguish, which is to say, I remember the specific weight of the backpack on my shoulders, the way my sneakers filled with water at the corner of Birch and Medford, the sound of the deadbolt turning behind me. I was 11 years, 4 months, and 9 days old. He told me to go to my grandmother's. He did not call my grandmother first. He did not put me in a car. He opened the door, placed my backpack on the porch, and went back inside. I stood there for approximately 40 seconds before I started walking. My grandmother lived 2 miles away. I knew the route because I had walked it before in daylight in summer. This was October, and it was not daylight. I counted cracks in the sidewalk to keep myself moving forward, a habit I still have when I am managing something that requires mechanical focus, rather than feeling. By the time I reached her door, my jacket had soaked through to the collar, and she was already standing on the porch with the outdoor light on as though she had been expecting me. She had not been expecting me. She simply had that kind of instinct, the kind that skips a generation and arrives in people who have survived enough to develop it. She did not ask me what happened that night. She took my backpack, brought me inside, and made me sit with my feet in a basin of warm water while she heated soup on the stove. It was only later, much later, that I understood she already knew. Not the details, not the specific reason he had sent me into the rain without a phone call or a coat, but the broad shape of it, the structural truth of what my father was and what he had done. She had been carrying that knowledge for years before I ever had to. What she knew, and what she passed to me through 7 years of living in her home and watching how she managed money with the careful precision of someone who trusts no one, was this. Property is the language that people like my father understand. Not conversation, not confrontation, not the legal system in the abstract. Concrete, titled, deeded, recorded property, the kind that changes hands through instruments and not sentiment. She left me everything she had in a revocable trust that converted to irrevocable upon her death in 2018. Structured specifically to prevent challenge under the no contest clause. She had insisted on with her estate attorney 3 years before she died. She had done this quietly, without telling him, without telling any of his 4 siblings, without a single Sunday dinner announcement or dramatic gesture of any kind. The first document I pulled from her files was dated 2003. I was 9 years old in 2003, and my father had already begun the legal maneuver that would explain everything. The quitclaim deed, the entity transfer, the single transaction that would take me 2 decades to fully trace, and another 2 years to legally dismantle. I set that document on my kitchen table, smoothed the fold with my palm, and for the first time since I was 11 years old standing on a porch in the rain, I felt something settle in my chest. Not anger, not grief, but the cold and clarifying recognition that I had already won. The quitclaim deed was filed on March 14, 2003 at 9:47 in the morning, at the county recorder's office 2 towns over from where we lived. I know the time because I requested the certified copy with the full filing stamp, and the clerk who processed my records request included every detail without knowing why I wanted them. My father had transferred the family home, the house my grandmother had purchased in 1979 for $84, Zuzu and deeded to him in 1997 as a gesture of maternal trust to a limited liability company registered in the name of a woman I did not recognize. He had done this 11 months before he put me out in the rain. He had done it 14 months after my mother died. The LLC was named Crestfield Property Solutions. It had 2 registered members, my father holding a 49% interest and a woman named Renata Voss, holding 51. I found Renata Voss in 20 minutes using nothing but a property search database and a county assessor's portal. She was 44 years old at the time of filing, a licensed real estate broker operating out of an office on the east side of the city, and she had been the selling agent on 3 separate transactions my father had conducted between 1999 and 2002. The professional relationship had begun, by the paper trail, approximately 8 months after my mother's funeral. The personal relationship I would later confirm through a single conversation with my father's former accountant, a man named Gerald, who retired in 2011 and had no particular loyalty left to protect, had begun considerably earlier than that. My mother died of a pulmonary embolism in January of 2002. She was 43 years old. She had a small life insurance policy, a joint checking account, and a 1/3 remainder interest in my grandmother's estate that was supposed to transfer to me upon my grandmother's death under the terms of a handwritten will my grandmother had executed in 1994. She had no independent estate plan because my father had told her on at least 2 occasions that my grandmother witnessed and remembered that it was unnecessary. They were young. There was time. He would handle everything. Those are the 3 sentences that have cost more people more money than almost any others in the English language. And my mother, who was brilliant at the things she cared about and entirely trusting of the people she loved, had believed every word. What my father understood, and what my mother did not, was that her remainder interest in my grandmother's estate was contingent on survivorship, language that had not been updated since 1994. When she died without a will, that interest did not pass to me. It evaporated. It folded back into the estate pool as though she had never existed in the document at all, which meant that when my grandmother eventually died, her estate would distribute according to a structure that my father had spent the intervening years quietly lobbying to shape. I do not use the word lobbying loosely. Gerald, the accountant, described it as a sustained campaign Sunday dinners. Home repairs volunteered and then invoiced internally, a pattern of isolating my grandmother from her other children through a combination of geographic convenience and manufactured grievance. My father lived closest. My father visited most often. My father became, in the language my grandmother used without realizing its legal weight, her primary caregiver. Primary caregiver is a phrase that carries specific gravity in probate proceedings. It suggests access. It suggests influence. In cases where a will is challenged on grounds of undue influence, the proximity of the alleged influencer to the testator during the period of drafting becomes one of the central questions. My grandmother had revised her will in 2001, in 2004, and again in 2007. I obtained all 3 versions through her estate records after her death. The 2001 version divided her assets equally among her 5 children. The 2004 version, drafted 13 months after my mother died, during the same period my father was spending every other Sunday at her kitchen table, reduced the share allocated to my mother's branch entirely, replacing it with a discretionary distribution to be managed by the executor. My father was named executor. The 2007 version removed the discretionary language and replaced it with a direct bequest to my father of the primary residence and all tangible personal property, with cash assets divided among the remaining siblings. I sat with these 3 documents for a long time the first night I found them. Not because I was surprised. I had suspected something structured for years, the way you suspect a load-bearing wall before you open it up and find the steel. But because I was measuring the patience it had required. He had worked on this for 6 years. He had repositioned himself, document by document, revision by revision, in the architecture of a grieving woman's estate while I was growing up in that same woman's house, eating her food, doing homework at her table, entirely unaware that the floor beneath my future was being methodically removed. There is a particular kind of cold that comes from that realization. It is not the cold of shock. It is the cold of confirmation, the body's response to finally seeing a shape it has always known was there. What my father had not accounted for, what people who operate through charm and proximity almost never account for, is documentation. My grandmother was not a formally educated woman, but she was precise. She kept everything. Grocery receipts from 1987, birthday cards organized by year in a shoebox. And in a fireproof lockbox I found at the back of her bedroom closet 3 weeks after her funeral, a sealed envelope with my name written on the front in her handwriting, containing a letter, a USB drive, and a single key I did not yet know how to use. The letter was 4 pages long, written on the same yellow legal pad she had used for grocery lists and phone numbers my entire childhood. Her handwriting was deliberate and slightly forward-leaning, the kind that belongs to people who learned penmanship as a serious discipline and never abandoned it. She had dated it October 3, 2017, 14 months before she died. During a period I now know she had already received the diagnosis she chose not to share with anyone except her physician and her estate attorney. She began without preamble, the way she began every important conversation, by stating exactly what she knew and exactly how long she had known it. She had known about Renata Voss since 2003. A neighbor had mentioned seeing an unfamiliar car parked outside the family home on weekday mornings, and my grandmother, who processed information the way a forensic accountant processes a ledger, quietly, completely, without visible reaction, had simply noted it and begun watching. She had known about the LLC since 2004, when her own attorney, reviewing a property tax document she had brought him for an unrelated question, noticed the transfer and flagged it. She had known about the will revisions in 2004 and 2007 because she had made them under what she described in the letter as sustained and escalating pressure that she had not fully recognized as pressure until she was outside of it. She wrote, "I told myself he was being practical. I told myself he understood these things better than I did. By the time I understood what I had signed, the signatures were already recorded. That sentence took me a long time to move past. Not because it surprised me, but because it is the sentence that explains everything. The mechanism by which intelligent, capable people are repositioned inside their own estates without ever feeling the movement beneath their feet." My grandmother was not naive. She had raised 5 children largely alone after my grandfather's death in 1981, managed a rental property for 11 years, and built enough equity in her primary residence to make her estate worth fighting over in the first place. What she was, and what my father had correctly identified and systematically exploited, was loyal. She believed, until the evidence became structurally impossible to ignore, that her son was managing her interests because he loved her. The distance between loyalty and legal vulnerability in estate proceedings is often no wider than a single signature line. The USB drive contained 63 files, scanned documents, photographs, a folder of voice memos she had recorded on her phone between 2015 and 2017 using an application her home health aide had installed for her. I listened to the voice memos in chronological order on a Sunday afternoon with the blinds drawn and a yellow legal pad of my own open on the table, in front of me. Her voice on those recordings was measured and entirely without self-pity, which made them more difficult to listen to than anything performed or dramatic could have been. She described specific conversations, specific requests. The Sunday in 2016 when my father had arrived with a notary and a document he describes as a routine estate update, and she had signed it at her kitchen table while her aide was in the next room, without her attorney present, without reading it in full because, she said on the recording, she was tired and he was impatient, and she had learned over the years that his impatience had a temperature to it that she did not want to raise. That document was a durable power of attorney, broadly drafted, granting my father authority over financial decisions in the event of her incapacity. She had not been incapacitated in 2016. She had been 73 years old and tired on a Sunday afternoon, and her son had brought a notary to her kitchen, and she had signed. I pulled the recorded instrument from the county filings the following morning. It was exactly as she had described, broad, durable, immediately effective rather than springing, which meant it did not require a physician's determination of incapacity to activate. He had held that document for 2 years before she died. I spent 4 months working with a forensic documents examiner and a probate litigation specialist to determine whether its execution conditions met the threshold for an undue influence challenge. They did. We documented every element: the absence of independent counsel, the presence of a financially interested party during execution, the testator's documented health status, the pattern of prior revisions. We built the challenge before we filed it, the way you build a structure completely before you remove the scaffolding. The key was the last thing I examined. It was brass, slightly tarnished, with a paper tag looped through the bow on a piece of kitchen twine. On the tag, in her handwriting, was a single address, not the family home, not her residence, but a property on the east side of the city that I did not recognize. I ran the address through the county assessor's database that same evening. The parcel was a commercial property, a small mixed-use building comprising 2 ground-floor retail units and 3 upper-floor apartments, purchased in 1988 and held in the name of a revocable trust my grandmother had established independently, with a separate attorney, without telling anyone in her family. The trust had been converting to irrevocable since 2015 on a predetermined schedule she had built into the original instrument. By the time she died, it was fully irrevocable, fully funded, and named a single beneficiary, which was not my father, and was not any of his siblings, and was not subject to the will he had spent a decade revising. It was me. It had always been me. By the time I had it independently appraised in the spring of Stusely 19, was worth $412,000, free and clear. I did not tell my father about the property on the east side of the city. I did not tell his attorney, his siblings, or the probate court appointed to administer my grandmother's estate. I told my attorney, a woman named Claudette who had practiced estate litigation for 26 years and had the specific quality I require in professionals. She communicated in facts without theatrical reassurance, and she never told me something was fine when it was not. I brought her the lockbox contents, the USB drive transcripts, the certified property records, and the 3 will versions in chronological order. She read everything over 2 meetings, asked 14 questions, and then told me we had enough to litigate and possibly enough to prevail, but that prevailing in probate court and prevailing strategically were 2 different objectives, and I needed to decide which one I was pursuing. I told her I was pursuing both. She said that was the correct answer, and we began. The probate filing on my grandmother's estate had been submitted by my father's attorney within 3 weeks of her death, which is efficient by any standard, and suggested the paperwork had been prepared in advance. The instrument submitted for probate was the 2007 will, the version that left him the primary residence and all tangible personal property, with cash assets divided among the remaining siblings. His attorney had filed an inventory that listed the family home, 2 vehicles, a brokerage account, and personal property. The inventory did not list the east side property. It could not list it, because the irrevocable trust that held it had never been part of my grandmother's probate estate. It existed outside the will entirely, in a separate legal structure she had built precisely, so that it could not be touched by whatever the will eventually said. She had understood, by 2015 at the latest, that the will was compromised. She had simply built around it. Claudette filed our undue influence challenge against the 2007 will on a Thursday in November of 2018, 4 months after my grandmother's funeral. The grounds were specific. The 2016 power of attorney execution had occurred without independent counsel, under conditions consistent with elder financial abuse under the state statute, and the pattern of will revisions between 2004 and 2007 demonstrated a sustained campaign of repositioning that tracked directly against my grandmother's documented wishes in the 2001 instrument. We attached the voice memo transcripts as exhibits. We attached the forensic documents examiner's report. We attached Gerald the accountant's sworn statement, which he gave willingly and in detail, because Gerald had spent 7 years in retirement carrying the specific discomfort of a man who had processed transactions he suspected were wrong, and said nothing. People like Gerald wait for someone to ask them directly. I had asked him directly in his kitchen over coffee, without accusation or pressure, and he had talked for 2 hours. My father's attorney filed a response within 30 days that was aggressive in tone and thin in substance, the legal equivalent of a raised voice, which tells you everything about the underlying position. They challenged our standing, challenged the admissibility of the voice memos, and submitted a counter-declaration from my father describing my grandmother as having been fully competent and entirely willing at every stage of every revision. That declaration was 4 pages long and contained, by my count, 11 statements that were directly contradicted by the documentary record we had already filed. Claudette noted each one in our reply brief with the precision of someone who had been waiting for exactly that kind of overreach. When your opponent's defense requires them to make provably false statements under oath, you do not interrupt them. You document every word and let the record accumulate its own weight. The undue influence challenge took 14 months to resolve. During those 14 months, the probate court issued an interim order freezing distributions from the estate pending resolution, which meant my father could not access the brokerage account, could not sell the family home, and could not transfer or encumber any estate asset without court approval. He had been living in the family home since my grandmother's death, rent-free, on the assumption that the 2007 will pass through probate without challenge, and the property would transfer to him within a standard administration timeline. The freeze did not remove him from the house. It simply meant that every month he remained there, the estate clock was running, the legal fees were accumulating against the estate assets he expected to inherit, and the property he believed was already his remained titled in a dead woman's name, while a court decided whether she had signed it away under duress. I watched this from a distance, the way I watch most things that are already in motion. I had purchased a small house of my own by then, using a portion of the irrevocable trust distribution that had transferred to me cleanly, and without contest 6 weeks after my grandmother's death. I had a kitchen with good light, a home office with a file cabinet, and a practice that was growing steadily because I was competent at my work and because competence, when it is quiet and consistent, accumulates the way interest accumulates, invisibly, until the balance is impossible to ignore. My father called me once during the 14 months, from a number I did not recognize, and left a voicemail that lasted 3 minutes and covered, in sequence, grief, accusation, an appeal to family loyalty, and a thinly veiled suggestion that I withdraw the challenge in exchange for a negotiated settlement he described as generous without specifying any terms. I saved the voicemail to 2 separate drives and forwarded the audio file to Claudette, who added it to the exhibit folder without comment. The morning the probate court issued its ruling, I was at my desk at 7 a.m. with coffee and the Gerald file open in front of me. Not because I needed it, but because I had developed the habit of keeping the source material close when I was waiting for a conclusion I had spent years building toward. Claudette called at 8:14. She said 3 words before she said anything else, and those 3 words were the ones I had structured an entire legal and financial architecture to earn. The court found in our favor on all primary grounds. The 2007 will was struck. The 2016 power of attorney was voided as an instrument executed under conditions consistent with undue influence upon a vulnerable adult. The estate reverted to the 2001 distribution structure, equal shares among 5 children, which meant my father's claim to the family home, the brokerage account, and the tangible personal property collapsed entirely into a 1/5 interest identical to every sibling he had spent a decade trying to outmaneuver. Claudette read the ruling summary to me in precise, unhurried language, and when she finished I set down my coffee cup, looked at the Gerald file on my desk, and felt nothing dramatic. What I felt was structural, the specific internal settling that happens when something load-bearing locks into place after a very long installation. My father's attorney filed a motion to reconsider within 10 days, which is standard procedure when a ruling goes badly and the client cannot accept the arithmetic. The motion cited procedural objections to the voice memo admissibility and challenged the evidentiary weight of Gerald's statement on grounds that his recollections were unverified and temporally distant from the events in question. The court denied the motion in 6 weeks. The denial was 3 paragraphs, which in judicial economy is the written equivalent of a door closing quietly but with finality. There was no appeal filed after that. I know because I checked the appellate docket myself, twice, at 30-day intervals. Some conclusions you verify personally, regardless of what you are told, not from distrust but from the discipline of a person who has learned that the paper record is the only version of events that cannot be revised by memory or sentiment. The estate administration concluded 7 months after the ruling. The family home sold at a number that was reasonable for the market and unremarkable for what it represented. A property my grandmother had purchased for $84,000 in 1979, maintained for 40 years, and nearly lost to a campaign of patient incremental manipulation. My 1/5 share of the net proceeds, combined with the irrevocable trust distribution I had received 2 years earlier, brought the total inheritance to a figure that my grandmother had always intended me to have, and that my father had spent the better part of a decade trying to redirect. I transferred the funds into a structure Claudette and I had designed specifically for long-term preservation, a dynasty trust, with a corporate trustee, a no-contest clause drafted with the specificity of someone who had seen firsthand what happens when language is left, imprecise, and a distribution schedule that prioritized capital preservation over access. I signed the trust instrument on a Wednesday afternoon in Claudette's office, in a room that smelled of old paper and radiator heat, with a pen she handed me without ceremony because she understood correctly that I did not need ceremony. What I needed, and what I had built over 20 years without fully naming it until that moment, was permanence. A legal structure so cleanly constructed that the people who had benefited from my family's vulnerability could never reach it, could never revise it, could never stand in a probate court and argue that a tired woman had meant something other than what she wrote. My grandmother had started that structure in 1988 with a commercial property and a separate attorney and the particular foresight of a woman who had watched enough to know that loyalty and legal protection are not the same thing, and that the people who love you most deserve both. I had finished it. The dynasty trust would survive me, would distribute to my children if I had them, and was constructed to resist challenge for as long as the law permitted such instruments to exist. It was, in the language of estate planning, perpetual, which is the closest thing to permanent that the legal system offers, and I had decided at 31 years old that it was close enough. My father moved into a rental unit on the west side of the city after the family home sold. I know this because the estate required a forwarding address for the distribution check, and the address his attorney provided was a 2-bedroom apartment in a building I recognized from a property database I had consulted during the litigation research. I did not drive past it. I did not need the visual confirmation of what a diminished circumstance looks like from the outside, because I had spent enough of my life understanding what it feels like from the inside. What I understood, and what I had perhaps always understood in the way you understand things that are taught to you not through instruction but through experience, was that the goal had never been his suffering. Suffering is not a transferable asset. It cannot be titled, recorded, or structured for perpetual distribution. It simply dissipates the way heat dissipates from a room when the source is removed, leaving behind nothing that compounds or appreciates or protects anyone. The goal had been the architecture. The goal had been to build, from the raw materials of a woman's foresight and a child's patience and 20 years of documentation, something that would outlast the original injury entirely. I had been 11 years old on a porch in the rain with a backpack and wet sneakers, counting sidewalk cracks on a 2-mile walk to the only person in my family who had already decided quietly and without announcement that I was worth protecting. She had spent the rest of her life building the instrument of that protection, and I had spent the rest of mine learning to complete it. On the Tuesday morning the moving company arrived at my father's house. I stood across the street and watched a leather recliner loaded into a truck, and I thought about a brass key on a piece of kitchen twine and a sealed envelope with my name written in forward-leaning handwriting, and a woman standing on a porch with the outdoor light already on, as though she had always known I was coming, and had made sure there would always be somewhere for me to arrive.